Can you think of the most random thing you've ever prayed for? You know, all my years of ministry, man, I have heard some really bizarre prayer requests. There's really not much that people won't pray for. I've had people ask me to pray that their cat would be healed. I've had other people pray that the Lord would bless a relationship that clearly does not honor him. I've heard of people praying for the closest parking spot at, the grocery store. Maybe even you have prayed to win the lottery at some point in time. I gotta be honest, I've prayed for my team to win as well. I've been a Browns fan my whole life. For 40 years, I've been praying for the Browns to win a Super Bowl. I guess it just seems like there are some prayer requests that the Lord does not answer. Have you ever noticed that the one thing that most people won't pray for, or the thing that people say you shouldn't pray for, is patience? You know, if you don't know by now, praying for patience is kind of the equivalent of praying for God to introduce problems into your life. Let's be honest, man, most of us, we already have enough problems. We don't need to pray for more of them. So it seems like, why would we want to pray for patience when all it's going to do is invite more problems into our life? Well, James teaches us something about this very topic. In the early part of chapter 5, in his letter, James begins to close out his instructions to these Christians that have been struggling because of the persecution that they were facing. These Christians that we've been talking about and studying throughout the entirety of this book. And in our passage today, James addresses this very topic of patience. Why would a little thing that seems almost insignificant like patience be so important throughout this letter where James has been tackling some really big topics? Topics like being doers of the word and enduring testing and trials and putting our faith into action and not showing favoritism toward one group of people or another. Well, the reason that he brings up patience is because the enemy had dialed up the temperature to a boiling point on this group of Christians who had been scattered in the diaspora for their faith in Jesus. And when the enemy turns up the heat is when it's hardest for Christians to have a heart. Have you ever noticed this to be true in your life? About 15 years ago, my wife, Becky, and I, we went through probably the most difficult season of our marriage. You know, it wasn't because of finances, it wasn't because of infidelity, it wasn't because of some sort of pornography addiction or her being a nagging wife. It wasn't even because of bratty kids. It was because of grief. You know, in the midst of an already difficult season of transition for Becky and I as we were moving to a new state, starting a new ministry, Becky lost her dad to a relatively short battle with cancer. It left Becky devastated and questioning the goodness of God in her life. And the worst part is that the grief sent her into a tailspin of depression that she didn't even know how to identify. She didn't have the language for it, and I didn't know how to fix it. And all I wanted to do as a husband was to chase away the dark clouds of despair that were kind of hanging over her life. You know, over the course of months, when we should have been turning to one another, we started turning on one another. Her family kept enduring death after death, and as a consequence, our marriage took hit after hit. See, shortly after her dad died, her grandma died, then her grandpa died, and over the span of about a year and a half, she had lost 3 of the closest people to her in her life. And after months and months of grieving and feeling emotionally off and disconnected, almost completely emotionally, we were missing each other in our marriage, kind of like ships in the night. We were just passing each other, just barely missing one another. And Becky and I, as a result, man, we just hit a low point in our marriage. We grew impatient with one another, and the impatience brought us to an impasse. And all the little nuisances had become big, giant irritants at that point. The molehills became mountains. And as you probably experienced in relationships yourself, difficulty in moments of tension can either bond you or they can break you. And Becky and I determined at that lowest point in our marriage that we were not going to be broken by this season of difficulty. We made a vow before the Lord on our wedding day that we were going to fight for us, just as Christ fought for his bride, the church. So whenever she, and by connection me, whatever we were going through, we were going to practice the art of patience in our marriage. We would ride out any storm that life would throw at us. And it mostly meant that I would have to be more patient with the Lord as we were waiting for him to pull her out of a pit of depression. Whether it took months, whether it took years, or God forbid, whether it would take decades. You know, someone once said, sometimes things aren't falling apart, they're just taking longer to come together. Patience waits for things to come together. You know, we love patience in theory, but patience is really only forged in the furnace of practicality. You can't pray for patience without first paying for patience. You've got to go through the experience, and experience is the best giver of that very thing that we want in our lives, patience. Now, picture Christians who had lost everything. The Christians that James was writing to 2,000 years ago, they had lost everything and scattered to worlds unknown, to languages unknown, to cultures unknown. Can you just imagine how high the tension would be in their personal lives and in their community and maybe even in the church? Can you imagine how Christians would even be on edge with other Christians? Maybe some of you thrive under pressure in your day-to-day life. For whatever reason, God has designed you for going through difficult things, and you're just as cool as the other side of the pillow. But for the rest of us who are more likely to melt under pressure in the midst of tribulation, James has a word for people like us. Don't turn on each other and complain and judgment. He tells us that when we're losing patience in our problems, to look like three different types of people. And this is what he says in James chapter 5. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. So here's what James is saying in that passage. He's saying, while you're waiting on Christ to return, be like three people. First of all, be like the farmer. A farmer has no control over the things that make his crops grow. You know, if it rains too little because of a drought, then it'll stunt the growth. But, you know, if it rains too much, it's going to rot out the crops. And if it freezes too soon in the season, it's going to freeze out those crops and they're never going to fully develop. Man, talk about a career field that requires a lot of patience and perseverance as a prerequisite. A farmer knows uniquely what prayer and patience looks like. He has literally all summer to just wait for the harvest after he's planted it. And while he waits, he works and he asks the Lord of the harvest to control the things that are completely out of his hands. You know, then next in the passage, James talks about the prophets of the Old Testament. He tells us to look to those prophets like Moses and Samuel and Isaiah and Elijah and Elisha and Daniel. These men were all national heroes. But you know the one thing that they all had in common? Every one of them were despised for the messages that they delivered to the people of their day, messages that came from the Lord. Many of them were persecuted and even killed because of the messages that they delivered. But these prophets proclaimed God's word both persistently and patiently, even if it made them unpopular. You know, lastly, James says in this text, he says to be patient and endure like Job from the Old Testament. You know, I think everybody wants to have the patience of Job, but nobody wants the path of Job. He went through a level of pain and suffering that I don't think any of us could possibly comprehend. It took 42 chapters of Job's suffering and waiting for God's purpose to be revealed until he realized what God was doing. And at the end of all of Job's suffering and questioning, he finally said this in Job chapter 42. He said, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Job's patience is a reminder that even in your pain, God has a plan. Even though this chapter in your life might be dark, God is not finished with your story. Be patient. Let it play out. You know, if you follow the NFL at all, you might remember back a few years ago when Russell Wilson was still playing as the quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks. You know, there's a pop culture phrase that was going around during that time when he was on the team. You might have seen it in headlines or in news articles. You might have seen it on, T-shirt slogans or whatever. But it said this. It said, "Let Russ cook." Let Russell Wilson go. Let him play. Trust his game. Let him do his thing, and he's going to bring you a victory. Let Russ cook. I don't mean to sound, sacrilegious or anything, but maybe in your life what you need to do is let the Lord cook. Let him go to work. Let him do what he does. Let him bring out the results. Let him weave a tapestry in your life. Even though right now it might look like everything is a mess all around you, I promise you he's cooking up something good. Be patient in the storm, and God will deliver you through it. You know what? Let's be Christians who look to Christ as the author and the finisher, perfecter of our faith, believing that God is writing for us a better story if we'll let him cook. And when we do, maybe we'll be considered blessed to remain steadfast like the prophets of old that James referred to in verse 11 of chapter 5. Let's think about all these things as we continue through the book of James.